Good morning, all. Thank you for those who are here already. And to those who are just joining us, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. And our conversation this morning is about the recent decision by the Israeli Defense Ministry to designate 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist groups. The decision came on October 22nd of this year, and those organizations include Addameer, al-Haq, Defense for Children International, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, the San Center for Research and Development, and the Union of Palestinian Women Committees. Israel alleges that the organizations have connections to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In their designation document, Israel claims that these organizations are an arm for the PFLP and used money obtained through forgery and deceit from Europe to fund, quote, terror activity, end quote. Furthermore, Israel has alleged that the groups are controlled by the senior leadership of the PFLP and employ many members of the groups in jobs in management on the ground, including activists who are involved in terrorism. This decision came as a surprise to both the European Union and the United States. In press briefings, Ned Price, department spokesperson, stated, "We believe that respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and a strong, independent civil society, we believe they're critically important to democracy and to responsible and responsive governance. And so we are currently engaging our Israeli partners for more information regarding the basis of these designations." We'll talk further about some of the responses in Congress and here in the United States, and also the international community's response. But before we do, I want to introduce to you the 2 speakers we have today, and our hope is they will help us better understand not only these designations and their significance, but what the response has been and how this decision has not happened in a microcosm. So I'll introduce them both and then spend a few minutes asking each of them questions before we open it up to those watching. You'll be able to put questions in the chat or using the question function on Zoom. So Laura Friedman. Laura is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. She has more than 25 years working in the Middle East foreign policy arena. She's a leading authority in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East with particular expertise in the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of U.S. Congress. She's published widely in the United States and in international press and is regularly consulted by members of Congress and their staffs, by Washington-based diplomats, by policymakers, and by journalists, and also by us at Churches for Middle East Peace. Good to have you, Laura, and I'm looking forward to, I've listened to some of your podcasts. I know you've been talking about this issue a lot lately, but looking forward in a few minutes to hearing what you have to say. Our other speaker is Michael Merriman Lotz. Mike worked with the American Friends Service Committee as the Palestine-Israel Program Director and has been in that role since 2010. Based in Philadelphia, he coordinates American Friends Service Committee's advocacy and policy work on Israel and Palestine. In his role, he's worked closely with AFSC's offices in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, and throughout the US. As a member of American Friends Service Committee's Middle East Regional Office, he also helped coordinate advocacy and programming related to other parts of the Middle East. From 2000 to 2003, he was a researcher with the Palestinian human rights organization al-Haq in the West Bank. And from 2007 to 2010, he worked with Save the Children, UK's Jerusalem office, managing child rights and child protection programming. He's managed community and local government development programs in Lebanon, Jordan, Yemen, and throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Welcome, Mike. Good to have you with us. All right, enough of introductions. Let's jump in. Laura, we'll start with you. So help us understand what's happened, but why is Israel designating these organizations as terrorist? Is the timing significant? What are the main things we need to understand about this decision?
Thanks, May, and thanks to Churches for Middle East Peace for having me, and it's a pleasure to appear with Michael. Look, the bottom line here is that for a lot of folks in the United States, I think in Congress, the administration, this seems like it came out of nowhere, and you're trying to wrap your mind around how this happened. for folks who have been watching what is called the shrinking space, that's the term that's used. I don't like the term shrinking space because it makes it kind of sound like weather, like it's just happening, as opposed to the attack on the space for civil society, which is what it is. But these attacks have been going on for quite a while. And the attacks on Palestinian human rights NGOs, and in particular, these 6 NGOs, have been going on now for years. And they've been focused mostly, these are attacks by the government of Israel, led until recently by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which recently was sort of folded into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and led by groups like NGO Monitor. They have been trying to make the case to Europe, because European funders are the big funders of these organizations. And they've been trying to make the case to Europe for years now to stop funding these terrible, annoying organizations that make Israel look bad in the international community. And fundamentally, that's what this is about. These are organizations that collect data, that publish data, that go to the world, that go to the ICC and say, listen, the rights of Palestinians are being violated. They work to defend them. They work to document the violations and to really compel the world to wake up and push Israel to change policies that violate Palestinian rights. And this is untenable from an Israeli perspective. If you go back to the earliest days of this effort, focused on Europe, it was about calling these organizations delegitimizers, right? They are seeking to delegitimize Israel, which is an existential attack on Israel's very existence. It's redundant, but you know what I'm saying. And then they were called, they're anti-Semitic, because of course, if you're focusing and if you're supporting BDS, the argument is, and BDS targets Israel, and therefore you're an anti-Semite by definition, because you're not focused on the entire world. And then it escalated to charges of there are affiliations with terror, there's people on your boards who are linked to terror. And then this escalation to the latest attack, which basically says you're all terrorists, done. It doesn't come out of nowhere. And up until this point, the Europeans have looked at this information that's brought to them each time by Israel, and it's year after year. There was a report not that many years ago from the Israeli government called Terrorists in Suits. I mean, they're not pulling their punches on what they're arguing here. And the Europeans, who are the funders, have spent, as far as based on my conversations with Europeans, they have spent enormous amounts of time and resources auditing their grantees on the ground, looking at every aspect of the accusations. And each time they've basically said, there's nothing here. There's nothing here. And what appears to have happened this time, there was another round of these efforts in May. A new dossier was sent to the Europeans, who looked at it and said, this is not sufficient. This doesn't prove anything. We could talk about why those allegations weren't seen as credible. And what appears to have happened is there was a decision taken in Israel. I don't know if it's taken at the highest levels, or if it was, folks who have been working on this for years, just bringing it before the new Minister of Defense, who maybe didn't understand the full implications. I just don't know. But the decision now was, we're just going to move on this and force Europe's hand. If they won't stop funding them, we'll make it impossible for them to fund them. And then when the outcry started, the Israelis focused on Washington, because they know they can't convince Europe. So the focus is now convincing Washington, where people are, blissfully or negligently unaware of the history of this effort targeting the groups.
And you just talked about this in terms of the lack of merit and the due diligence of these funding bodies. Is there any evidence? I mean, we've had people argue, who don't agree with Churches for Middle East Peace's approach, and particularly response to this issue. We've had esteemed leaders argue that we're just naive, that of course these groups have connection, to historical acts of violence against civilians, to terrorist activities. And, how would you respond to someone who says you're ignoring, the fact-based evidence of how many Palestinians are imprisoned or have engaged in violent resistance, to end the occupation?
So the first way I would respond is saying you should listen to the podcast I did yesterday with Michael Sfard, who's Israel's preeminent human rights lawyer, because I asked him pretty much that exact question. Well, I mean, for folks who want to defend the Israeli designation, there's a couple of tacks you can take. One is to say, you people defending these NGOs, how can you defend them? You haven't seen the evidence, it's secret. And to some extent, I will say there is validity there. I don't know every bit of evidence that they're showing to the US government. I do know what they showed the Europeans, because that dossier is now circulating, and there's 2 articles in the Israeli press sort of laying out what's in it and taking it apart. And those dossiers and the statements from the Israeli government since this latest designation really suggest that we're all talking about the same thing, that what they're showing to Congress is the same thing they showed to Europe. And what I've heard in terms of gossip here in Washington from people who've talked to people who were briefed by the Israelis, it sounds like the same dossier. And that evidence boils down largely to confessions extracted from 2 Palestinians who worked for a different organization, not one of the 6 that was designated, who were fired by that organization for stealing money, who were then arrested by Israel, and in the course of interrogations are, implicating all of these 6 groups. What they're implicating them in is interesting. If you and the longer article today, it's in The Intercept and in 972, which I encourage people to read it, where they're actually comparing the statements in the dossier that was sent to the Europeans with what was actually said in the confessions that at least one of the people now, one of the people who confessed is saying were coerced. But they're confessing to things like, all of these groups support PFLP activities. And then if you read the rest of the sentence, which isn't in the dossier, they define those activities as, dance troupe activities like Dubke. It specifically mentions Dubke, which is kind of hilarious, terrorist dancing. They have another thing where they lay out a set of activities that all the groups are involved in, each one by one. And it includes things like, women's empowerment, health services. It is quite extraordinary. Under Israeli law, Israel has a very broad anti-terror law. All of these things basically qualify as terrorism if they align with the goals of a terrorist organization, notwithstanding the fact that certainly under any normal understanding of what is terrorism, a dance troupe, even one that is a Palestinian national dance troupe, doesn't qualify as terrorism. So, that's the challenge there. The broader argument, which is one that NGO Monitor has been working, and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs have worked for years to basically say, don't pay any attention to what these organizations do. All these facts about human rights violations, and none of that matters. All that matters is there's someone on the board who is the brother of someone who used to be a PFLP leader, or there's someone on the staff who 20 years ago sat next to. Okay, fine. This is called guilt by association, and for some people, it may be compelling. Under a normal sense of what is and isn't terrorism, it is not terrorism. And I think it's really important for people to understand that under Israeli law, virtually all political activism, engagement, identification by Palestinians in the West Bank is terrorist. All of the organizations are terrorist organizations, Fatah, the PLO, all of it. It is a decision by Israel to set up a structure where any Palestinian activity that they want to stop can be deemed terrorist activity. Mm-hmm. And when you create a structure where every Palestinian is 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees separated from something Israel calls terrorism, you have a very convenient structure here to quash anything you don't like. We don't know I've heard from people in Washington, there's additional evidence here. We'll see. We'll see if there is. The track record of more than a decade of Israel trying to make this case suggests that they have a very, very thin case, and they're hoping with this designation to not have to actually try that case under any sort of normal, not just a court of law, but any sort of normal scrutiny, right? Because if the US decides to designate these groups, now you have your evidence. You don't need to prove anything. The US designation of these groups as terrorist organizations, it's done, right? And even if they don't designate, just by the Israeli designation, the banks can no longer fund, you can no longer move money to these groups. So even if Europe says we don't think they're terrorists, we want to support them, if this isn't rolled back, you can't fund them. Say they will all die on the vine anyway. This is an escalation in a process that has been going on for years. And for people who say, listen, none of that matters, Israel says they have this, we have to take it at face value. It's sort of like you've got a guy who's been, calling the fire department every week for the past 5 years saying, there's a fire, come out, there's a fire. And then one day there's a fire and people are like, his neighbors are like, I think it might be arson. People are like, how dare you call it arson? There is ample reason to be very, very suspicious. On top of that, and this is the last thing I'll say, these are known organizations. I mean, I don't know all of them equally well. The international response when you say that al-Haq is a terrorist group is not because people are in denial and don't want to believe it. It's because they know al-Haq. They know DCI Palestine. They know Addameer. You can like or not like everything Palestinian human rights groups do. These are known organizations. They're enormously professional. They operate and are financed in the most above board manner and subject to so much scrutiny of their activities and finances. I mean, it is, when my Israeli colleagues in the Israeli human rights groups are standing up by the way, in potential violation of Israeli law to defend them, it's not because they're in denial. It's because they know these organizations well, and this simply doesn't pass the sniff test.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I'm eager to get Mike's perspective and engagement. And Mike, in reading your bio, I didn't realize you actually worked with al-Haq. So you can speak firsthand from on the ground experience. So what's your response to the question of, is there any evidence, or how should we respond when people say we're naive, in response to these designations?
Well, I mean, I think that Laura's covered a lot of this, but part of it is to say that these allegations, as Laura said, are not new, and they have been pretty thoroughly assessed. I think one of the reasons that you see this moving into the public sphere in this way this year is that most of the attempts to make these allegations through other channels were rejected within the last year, and so. There was an attempt to claim that PricewaterhouseCoopers, who are the auditors for several of these organizations, was ignoring their financial responsibilities and ignoring links between these organizations and the PFLP in their audits, and that they had been incorrectly completing audits. That allegation, which had been made by several organizations backed by the Israeli government, was investigated by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development earlier this year, and found to be unfounded and rejected. As Laura said, the dossier that is now being shopped in Washington was shared to the European Union, to the Dutch and Belgian and other governments, and they all rejected the dossier and said there was no compelling evidence within the dossier to show any kind of malfeasance on parts of the organization. The UK lawyers for Israel had sued or had made allegations against DCI Palestine in the UK, alleging also that they were linked to the PFLP, and the British courts investigated those and found them to be libelous claims. And all of that's happening within the last year. And so what you have is courts and international bodies in the EU and other groups rejecting these claims one after another. And so in that situation, you've moved then into a place where the government can make this declaration, and that then has legal consequences for anybody who provides support to these organizations. It reopens the closed investigations that governments had already rejected, and so it forces this conversation, which then obstructs the work of these organizations. And I think that's the main goal. There was an Israeli official who told Haaretz yesterday in an article that the main goal of this was to disrupt the funding of these organizations. And so it's not something that is being hidden at this point. And I think it's important to highlight some of the work that the organizations are doing, and why also this year may be a point when trying to attack the work of these organizations is becoming more important for the Israeli establishment. When I worked with al-Haq in 2002, the ICC came into existence, the International Criminal Court, and al-Haq immediately at that point began sitting down with its researchers and lawyers and saying, based on the experience in the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, what's the level of evidence that you need to prove that war crimes have been committed and that crimes against humanity have been committed here in Palestine. And if we're going to take advantage of the court, how do we do that? Drawing upon the decades of documentation of human rights abuses that exist within the organization and the work that we plan on doing moving forward. And began to look through that. And it was, starting in 2015, al-Haq, together with Addameer, and one of the other targeted organizations, and al-Mizan and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights in Gaza, started to submit briefs to the International Criminal Court, alleging war crimes both in the West Bank and Gaza. And in March of this year, the International Criminal Court accepted that documentation and opened up an investigation into the possibility of war crimes in the West Bank and Gaza that could implicate Benny Gantz, who is the defense minister who signed this order. And in addition to that, DCI Palestine has been running the No Way to Trade a Child campaign, which has resulted in the first ever legislation on Palestinian children's rights in Congress and opening discussion about conditioning of military aid. The Union of Agricultural Work Committees, as an organization, is the organization that provides assistance to Area C communities in the West Bank, and that provides a lot of the documentation to Europeans and others who are opposed to settlements, and to information on the impact of settlements on Palestinian communities in Area C of the West Bank. And so, these are organizations that have fundamentally shifted in some ways the discourse on Palestinian rights, and who've opened up new channels for accountability that are starting to have some impact internationally. And as those channels, as those shifts happen, as the discourse on apartheid starts to open up with Human Rights Watch reports and reports from B'Tselem and other Israeli human rights organizations that are accepting that terminology, which is really coming from the work that these organizations have done over the last decade. That's where the conversation about delegitimization by the Israeli government comes in, and it's the reason why you have these increasing attacks on these organizations and their work. There isn't another way right now to counter that work, and so the easiest way to counter that work, if you can't counter the factual information, is to attack the organizations themselves.
Thank you, and this is so helpful. And you've talked some about one of the immediate repercussions of the potential for funding to be, re-scrutinized, or lack of funding suffocating, the work of these organizations. Talk to us a bit more about the repercussions for these organizations specifically, but also for those of us who are parallel advocacy organizations. And I'll just give you a quick anecdote. Laura, as you talked about the progression of this is not new, and how this has culminated in this designation because there's not alternatives to being able to quell the work of these organizations. My most recent book is called Beyond #Activism, and I talk about different types of advocacy, social advocacy, legal advocacy, economic advocacy, political advocacy, and I elevate al-Haq as an example of what constructive legal advocacy could look like. And it was the one thing that was picked up out of the book. I mean, there's articles about how I support terrorism. This was before the designation, right? But it was a glimpse of kind of, for those of us who are doing advocacy work in parallel, what scrutiny might come to us. But talk to us, Mike, specifically about how does this limit the work of these organizations? What are the potential repercussions? And then for the broader advocacy community, what's this mean?
Long term, I think the organizations themselves are struggling to figure out what the long term implications of this are. I think one thing that's important just to note is that this declaration was made under Israeli law, and in accordance with Israeli law, which is applicable within Israel, but is not applicable within the occupied Palestinian territories where these organizations are actually located. And so, the law declares them terrorist organizations, and that in itself could result in the seizure of funds from the organization, the closure of their offices, the arrest of staff, the complete shutdown of their work if the Israeli government so chooses. To do that, it would need to act militarily, and so there's another level of action that would need to be taken. The Israeli military would need to issue a military order that essentially repeats the allegations that the that have been made within this declaration by the Israeli government. That hasn't happened is in and of itself somewhat telling. But the impact of this is that all of these organizations are left in a situation of uncertainty. Are they going to be attacked by the military? Are they going to be shut down? Are they going to be closed? It opens up again these conversations with the donors. It forces the donors to say, we're going to take this seriously. We're going to look at it, even if they've already rejected these charges. It opens them up to the possibility of audits, again, which they do their annual audits, but that's a cumbersome process that slows down their work. And it opens up or further opens questions about the legitimacy of their work as they go about doing political advocacy. So anybody who wants to attack any of us who are working with these organizations or who are using their information, anybody who wants to attack the advocacy that they do when they come to the United Nations or to the US government and do advocacy can say, hey, you're listening to terrorist organizations. And it's a smear that is there now, and you can't really get rid of it once it's made in public, even if it is rejected by all responsible parties. And so it's there just to make the work that they're doing more difficult and to distract from the conversation about the rights violations that Israel is committing in the West Bank and the reality of occupation there and in Gaza.
Okay, thank you. My last question for you, Mike, or go ahead, Laura.
Just to add to that,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm often the alarmist voice, and I hope I'm wrong on these things, but as someone who's watched the lawfare, which is the term we use for the various efforts to shut down work around the Palestinians using laws and regulations, I think that the jeopardy is actually is I don't think people have really thought through entirely how far this jeopardy goes. Inside Israel, you already have efforts being launched to have criminal investigations against Israelis. These are the Israeli NGO leaders, even one Israeli member of the Knesset, who have spoken out in defense of and solidarity with the NGOs, basically saying that they are breaching Israel's anti-terror law, which the law is so broad, I think an argument can be made that they are, and they're liable for up to 3 years in prison if Israel decides to go ahead with that. Beyond that, if these designations stand, there has been an effort ongoing. I mean, Michael talked about the PricewaterhouseCoopers case, which dragged on for a long time. There's been efforts going on now for a very long time where every time someone from a Palestinian NGO is speaking at a university, there are organizations that churn out letters warning the university that they may be violating US material support laws. I think we should anticipate that sort of thing ramping up. We did a webinar last week where we had representatives of all 6 organizations on a Zoom webinar. I don't think it's alarmist to imagine that not long from now, if this is not pushed back, you will see an effort targeting Zoom to deplatform these voices. So you won't be able to hear from Palestinian human rights defenders. And those of us who work with them will be there will be an effort to deem us untouchable and deplatform us. And I think there's also the issue for anyone who has been funding these groups, which is, the effort to ramping up the effort to say that under U.S. law, because of the Israeli designation, this counts as material support. So I think this is a narrow attack, but there's first order consequences, second order consequences, third order. And the biggest order consequence, I've said for years, maybe you don't care at all about Israel-Palestine. So maybe you don't care about like anti-BDS laws or whatever, because you don't do Israel-Palestine. Israel-Palestine cares about you because these are templates for policies that can be applied to anything. And if the international community, if the US and Israel, or the US and Europe are willing to allow this to stand, they are giving a kosher stamp for countries, and other countries are already doing this, right? Other countries are saying, oh, it's terrorism, we're arresting this human rights worker. But when they do, the world says, no, this is terrible. If we're going to say it's okay for Israel to do it, let's admit that the entire civil society sector, human rights defender sector worldwide, has no one to stand up and defend it any longer. And that is that's pretty terrifying.
And there's not a lack of of precedent for all of those attacks. That the attacks on Zoom or the deplatforming in that area would really be a follow-on to the existing effort to deplatform funding for these organizations, to stop the ability of these organizations to receive charitable giving through online donations, which has had some success over the last few years, because financial organizations don't need legal proof to step back. The way that anti-terrorism laws are structured, they are risk-adverse institutions, and so even rejected allegations are enough to cause a financial institution to step back and to stop allowing organizations to receive funds through their transfer mechanisms, and that's been used against these organizations throughout this lawfare process. And the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights was sued because of its connections to the Boycott National Committee in support for BDS. And that case has been thrown out in the courts, but is under appeal. And that type of attack, yes, is the type of attack that those of us with connections to these organizations may expect in the future and need to be concerned about. And the goal of most of those lawsuits, which are targeting groups like the U.S. Campaign, but also Oxfam, Norwegian People's Aid, and other organizations who are being sued because of their work in Palestine, those a portion of or a part of the reason for those attacks is simply to stop the work of those organizations, to make everybody fearful of supporting Palestinian rights or supporting projects in Palestine. And so even if the attacks don't succeed, or if the lawsuits don't succeed, for those who are making the allegations, just simply having things move through the courts is enough to be considered successful.
In that regard, talk to us a bit, and maybe we'll start with you, Mike, about what's happening in Washington, D.C. So I know there was a recent letter to Secretary Blinken sent by a number of Christian faith groups. Has there been a response? Should we expect Israel to reverse its designation? Is that even in the cards? And then, of course, we want to talk about what's happening in Congress as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a fairly significant pushback against this from a number of different directions. Obviously, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International were two of the first organizations to come out and condemn this designation. A number of us within the faith community, CMEP, AFSC, and another 13 churches and church-based organizations sent a letter to Secretary of State Blinken asking for a reversal of or for a condemnation of this decision, and asking him to push the Israelis to reverse the decision. We haven't received a response yet, but there was another sign-on letter from 288 different organizations in support of these organizations and calling for a reversal of this action. And there has been some response in Congress. Representative Betty McCollum has introduced House Resolution 751. It's a resolution that also speaks to the value of these organizations, condemns the declaration of these organizations as terrorist groups, and calls on President Biden and the Secretary of State to both publicly condemn this action and to call for its reversal. There are currently 10 co-sponsors on that bill, and many of us will be continuing to push for support for that bill, and hope that others here will contact their representatives to ask them to support it. And where this goes depends a lot on how state responds and how the administration responds to the dossier that the Israelis are chopping to them right now. I think the hope is that dossier will be rejected, as it has been in Europe, that it will be declared not credible, and that the Secretary of State and others within government will come out and say that there's an importance in protecting Palestinian society, and that this is an unacceptable political attack on these organizations. I'm also a little bit pessimistic on some of these things. I am optimistic that the U.S. government will reject this. I think that the Israeli goal is to have ultimately their decision accepted by the Office of Foreign Assets Control here in the U.S., so that these organizations would be declared terrorist organizations by the U.S., and that would have really significant impacts globally. It really would result in a closure of these organizations and a criminalization of any support of these organizations if the U.S. were to move in that way. I'm hopeful that will not happen. But the U.S. not moving on the Israeli declaration is is different than the Israelis themselves moving back this declaration. I think it's going to be hard for the Israelis to walk this back, even if there is no credible information for them to come out and say now, no, sorry, we were wrong. These organizations aren't, don't have any links. Would be a loss of face that I don't think that they're willing to take. So I think this is a situation where we're going to be living with this reality for an extended period, and it's going to be therefore really important for there to be political pushback in the US and in Europe, saying that this is unacceptable and that we will continue to support these organizations regardless of what the Israeli government is saying.
And in that regard, we would encourage those who are watching to engage with us and to take action. So we've put 2 action alerts in the chat, one from Churches for Middle East Peace, one from AFSC, and we'd encourage you to sign both, calling on the US government to, in support of McCollum's recent response to this situation. So we'd encourage you to take action in that regard. Laura, what are you hearing and seeing in Washington, D.C.? The Biden administration's response. Do you agree with Michael's assessment that, certainly it's unlikely that Israel would backtrack in this regard, but in terms of what might come next and what the repercussions might be on the U.S. front?
Look, I'm not terrifically optimistic. I share Michael's analysis. I think that Israel has with this action is so far on a limb. I think it's very, very difficult for it to walk back. I don't think it's impossible, particularly if it gets enough strong pressure from Europe. I mean, I do think it's possible. I think it's very unlikely. This is years in the making. Regardless, I'm not going to lose hope that the Biden administration will look at this information, and the intelligence community will analyze it in a professional way and likely come to the same conclusion the Europeans did. Realistically, this administration seems to have a general attitude about Israel-Palestine, which can be summed up as, we don't want to spend political capital on this. We don't want to fight with Israel. And there's no way to engage them on this issue which won't involve political capital. That's just the reality. And in this case, I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to imagine that if they were to come out against rejecting the Israeli designation, that you would see a Republican push calling the Biden administration supportive of terror. And that is something that certainly they probably have in mind. My guess is that the best one can hope is that they won't publicly endorse it, which then leaves it to Europe to do the real pushing back. What's interesting so far in Congress, and we've seen this, there's a lot of briefings going on. The Israelis were in town last week, the Ministry of Defense in Shin Bet, briefing on the Hill, briefing in the administration. Not for nothing. I mean, I think there's one article, there's one big article today, it's 972 in The Intercept. There's another big article in Haaretz, basically, breaking the news that this is essentially, they're telling members of Congress, this is all new, no one's seen it before, we're coming to you first, not the Europeans. I think initially that was greeted with a great deal of belief, because it's hard to argue with like a Shin Bet person saying, here's our evidence, these people have all confessed. I think as it becomes clearer on the Hill that the Israelis aren't being entirely honest with how they're presenting this, that this dossier is almost certainly warmed over stuff that's already been rejected by Europe. They're not coming to the U.S. first, they're coming to the U.S. last. And I think that as more light is shed on this, certainly the questions I'm getting suggest that there is some at least skepticism around that maybe didn't exist the first couple of days. I don't know about inside the administration. Just really quick though, for this audience in particular, I want to just go back for a second to what preceded this. And I saw someone in the chat saying, what is correct, which is most people don't even know about this, and they, Israel is the victim of terror, and just leave it at that. I want to remind people of the World Vision case. This is a community of faith call, right? 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, the Israelis spectacularly, with headlines, arrested a guy named Mohammed Halabi from Gaza, who was a staff member of World Vision, and accused him and said they had rock solid evidence proving that he was funneling huge amounts of money that came from Australia to Hamas. And at the time, World Vision took a step back. We have to investigate this. Australia took a step back. Both Australia and World Vision investigated this at length in an incredible depth, and they both came out with nothing. They said we don't find any evidence, and the charges on their face were absurd. The amount of money he was accused of funneling to Hamas was more than the amount of money that World Vision was putting to the entirety of Palestine. That aside, 5 years later, Mohammed Halabi is still in jail, still in secret evidence and secret trials. And I would recommend that people look at the editorial that came out from the Jerusalem Post. It was a week ago, Friday or Saturday. It came out right when this NGO story first broke. And the Jerusalem Post editorial basically said Israel has to show the world its evidence, because the Mohammed Halabi case basically proves they can't be trusted. And their line, this is a not left-wing, outlet, is they're basically saying the only thing that seems to make sense now that Israel is still keeping this guy in jail on secret evidence and secret trial is because they're afraid to let it become known that they've been holding an innocent man for this long, right? And it appears they're ready to hold him forever if he's not willing to plea bargain so they can save face. That is the precedent for using, testing out using terror charges against human rights defenders and humanitarian workers. The problem is that this is 5 years. I think, maybe we're reaching a point where the Israelis are going to say, fine, we'll let this guy go. But 5 years is longer than these NGOs that we're talking about today have. If they're not funded for 5 years because they're fighting this terrorism label, they will cease to exist. And Palestinian human rights, as Michael said before, everyone's busy focusing on defending their existence, while the human rights agenda that they exist to serve is unserved or goes by the wayside, right? And let's remember as well that some of these groups like al-Haq are as critical of the PA as they are of Israel. These are the defenders of free speech, the demands for democracy, the demands for elections, the demands for respect for human rights from both Israel and the PA. These are those groups. And those groups right now, the term Michael Sfard used yesterday was these designations are the equivalent of capital punishment for the organizations. And I don't think that is in any way hyperbole.
Laura probably knows this, but others may not. My role before I came to Churches for Middle East Peace was overseeing U.S. advocacy work specific to Palestine for World Vision. And I worked with Mohammed al-Halabi, to your point, Laura, of the charges, the amount that he was accused of having funneled to Hamas was 3 times more. It was over a 10-year period of time, and it was a multiplication of the actual total budget for Gaza, and he wasn't even the head of the Gaza program at that time.
I think it's worth adding, I forgot to say, all of this was successful. If the Israeli goal with the Mohammed Halabi accusations was to get World Vision to stop funding in Gaza, it worked, right?
Well, and not only that,
funding Gaza.
Not only that, there were 7,000 Palestinian children in the World Vision programs out of 47,000, but World Vision had a robust advocacy program based in the US that essentially, it no longer exists. And so it was not only successful in, the effects on Mohammed's life, the effect on all those children's lives who, had the programs continued, would have been able to have basic needs met. It also was effective on shutting down advocacy in the US space. And so the broad repercussions of it, I think, to your point, can't be overstated. I'm sensitive to, we have another 10, maybe 15 minutes if people have questions they'd like to ask. I'll ask one more question, but please do fill in the chat or in the you can't raise your hand, but you could put it in the question or answer, because we're eager to get your questions answered. We talked a little bit about the effects of this designation on Israeli human rights groups. What else should the international community be doing to ensure, I think that the alarm has been raised in terms of the potential, World Vision being an example cited, of the potential devastating effects of this decision. But how should the international community be responding so that Palestinian human rights organizations can continue to do their work? What recourse do we have on this side? Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I mean, I think one of the most important things is they need to continue funding these organizations. I mean, that's really what much of this is targeted at, is getting funding cut off from these organizations, closing down the financial channels that these organizations use to access funding. I think insisting that they reject these charges, that it won't stop them from funding these organizations, that it won't stop them from allowing financial transfers to these organizations is key. And insisting that these types of attacks on Palestinian civil society won't be accepted and won't be given legitimacy is important. That international actors have to be speaking out. And as Laura said, I think it's important to say that this isn't just a case for Palestine, that this is the test case for what other governments may do and what may happen in other situations. So it's important to say that overall, we're going to make sure that we're protecting space for civil society and for human rights defenders, and that we're going to do everything that we can as an international community to ensure that space for those actors is maintained, that the support that they need is there. And then if there are legal repercussions for these organizations, if there are further attacks, if there are attempts to close them down or politicized trials that maybe move forward, I think that there needs to be action to address those things. And I think that all of this, outside of kind of the response to the Israeli action, should call into question, to a certain extent, the whole framework for counterterrorism and the impacts that it has on civil society globally, and the way in which civil society space has shrunk over the last 2 decades because of the effective preemptive guilt that is put on civil society in many locations. The idea that that civil society has to prove itself innocent at all times, and that civil society is a high risk as opposed to a good actor. And so that governments overall, I think, outside of just the response in Palestine, will need to look at how they are working with civil society to support human rights accountability, to support development, to support change in different areas, without placing all of these organizations on the defensive, and how the counterterrorism or the terrorism charges being abused in many locations to restrict space and rights.
We have a question. Is Visualizing Palestine working on any graphics to explain this? Their work provides a very digestible explanation of issues for the general public. Do either of you know? Are you aware? That might be a possibility. No. I'm curious, Laura, what do you see immediately on the horizon in terms of are we now at the point where we just need to be educated about it? What's your answer to the question about how the international community should best respond? And my other specific question is, how much money are we talking about? Most of these NGOs I thought were pretty small, that we're not talking about. Are we talking tens of millions? Are we talking hundreds of millions? In terms of the threat of funding being cut, might there be alternative funding sources is part of my question.
So on the funding piece of it, I don't know the exact numbers. The funding amount isn't the issue. I mean, these are very lean organizations. They do incredible work on very low budgets. The bottom line, though, is that the Palestinian banking system relies on the Israeli banking system. You can't move money to Palestine without using Israeli banks. And under Israel's anti-terror law, Israeli banks can no longer touch these organizations. That is the point here. People still wanting to fund is fine. One of the things that is notable, these organizations are sophisticated, accountable organizations that operate above the radar. They operate in the legal system. They're not operating on people coming in with suitcases full of cash, right? If the argument is, well, for them to continue, Israel will let them operate, but now they have to operate as if they're illegal organizations with people coming in with suitcases of cash. I don't think that's plausible. The problem now is it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to get them money, even if you want to fund them. And that is, again, to look at a precedent. There is a case against a UK bank. It was actually dismissed in US court, and now it's being appealed to the Supreme Court. And this is a lawsuit by people related to or part of who are harmed in some way by Hamas during harmed in the second Intifada. They're blaming Hamas, and they are suing this UK bank because this UK bank gave banking services to Interpol, which was not a designated terror organization under UK law, but was on the US list. So they're trying to get US courts to have a finding of material support for terror against a UK bank for giving banking services to an organization that wasn't on the UK's forbidden list. This is the lawfare, and this is the jeopardy that banks are thinking about. So I think, again, this even if the US and Europe don't give a kosher stamp to what Israel's done here, the banking system is going to look at it and say, we have fiduciary responsibility, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, this has an enormous chilling effect, even if there was still a way to get stuff in. And I think it's very, very difficult to see how that will happen. Remind me of the first part of your question. I'm sorry.
Just speaking about kind of what options there are for advocacy groups, international advocacy groups.
So I basically, I think Michael covered it well. I will say it maybe slightly different terms. One of the ways that Israel has for decades sort of gotten away with doing things that the world says they don't approve of, whether you're talking about settlements or land seizures or home demolitions, is that you will have sort of like an outburst of focused opposition, and then people just give up and walk away, or they lose interest. This is something where folks can't lose interest. And already, I think, my guess, based on what I'm seeing in the Israeli media, I think Israel is already surprised at how much pushback there is. I think they need to continue to be surprised at the political and reputational harm it does them to be seen to be attacking these NGOs. To the extent Michael referred to a letter from 200 plus organizations, I think it's really great to look at that list of organizations because it includes a lot of organizations that are not Israel-Palestine focused. And that is critical, is this understanding that this is not just an Israel-Palestine issue, and it's not just this niche group of people who focus on Palestinian rights who are concerned, that it's much, much broader. And that has to be sustained. At the end of my podcast with Michael Svard yesterday, he actually sounded a note of hope, because I think this is unprecedented, both in the action that Israel has taken as being so beyond what any lines that I think people imagined it was likely to cross. Everyone knew it could do this, but didn't expect it to. But also in the pushback that we've seen so far across a really broad population, that has to be sustained. And Michael has not given up hope that could push Israel to in some way roll this back or change something to make this a different ballgame. And I think I have to hold on to that hope as well.
A word of hope is a good word to end on. I have one more question and then we'll close. And this came through the chat. Not one person outside of my organization or my circle doing Palestinian advocacy had even heard of this. They have no idea about the organizations and only see Israel as the victim of terrorist actions. How do we bring these issues that you just mentioned, Laura, to the public square? So I think what they're saying, the groups outside of Palestinian advocacy just don't even know that this is an issue. What are ways we can take this to groups, the kind that you talked about?
I don't have a simple answer. For me, I have been writing for years and talking for years. Like what I said, you may not care about Israel-Palestine. You may not want to go near Israel-Palestine. You may see it as the third rail politically for everything you do. But Israel-Palestine is coming for you. It's coming for your free speech. Let's talk about anti-BDS laws, which are anti-free speech laws. I wrote a piece in 2018 sounding the alarm. And in that article, I said, even if you don't care about Israel-Palestine, these laws that are being passed across the United States to punish people who boycott Israel or settlements, you could change just a handful of words and apply it to anything. And lo and behold, in 2021, we have multiple states, particularly Texas and Oklahoma stand out, that have now adopted legislation using the anti-boycott Israel legislation as a template. People are public in saying that's the template. And now you have legislation to punish companies that discriminate in quotes, against the guns and ammunition industry, and to punish companies that boycott the oil and gas industry, right? This is coming for your free speech. So, I think this is starting to get through a little bit. If you look at some of the groups that are speaking out, ACLU has been stronger on this as the threat to free speech has become clear. We're doing a webinar tomorrow where someone from the ACLU about this NGO issue, someone from the ACLU will be on that. But this is something for folks, across the networks where you are active. This needs to be injected into the discussion, not as necessarily you need to make Israel-Palestine the #1 issue you care about, but you have to understand how Israel-Palestine, as an issue that has such political weight and it's such a political weapon being used in US political discourse. You have to understand how this issue is really relevant to the things that maybe you care about more, because it is.
Yeah, thank you. Mike, last word?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, if you are able, just taking time to talk with people about this and about why it's important to them, and to start to talk to people about human rights abuses and issues in Israel and Palestine that may be outside of their understanding. No, I mean, as Lang said, it's a hard issue, and I think, as somebody who comes from originally a very small town in rural Washington State, I understand that this is not the top issue for people who are living around my parents or in the many areas of the country, and it's not ever going to be a top issue for them. And so I don't expect it to be, but this has an impact, as Laura said, on laws. It's also impacting the templates that have been used have also been used to shape laws critical of education around issues of race in this country. And we are giving massive amounts of money to Israel that have offset costs. So we give $3.8 billion per year. We just committed another $1 billion this year in military funding to Israel. And there is yet another request coming for additional bombs by the Israeli government to the US for additional funding. So this is something that, as we are talking about how do we pay for healthcare and how do we pay for education, and how do we pay for other things that are hard to cover in this country, but that are needed, they're offset costs. So how do we raise up some of those issues to people here who may not have this as their top concern, but who can see that maybe the use of funding for more weapons for Israel is not the best use of funding. But it is just continuing to press and continuing to open conversation and to continue to try and find where people can see some relevance to this issue in their lives, and to understand the negative impact that the US policy and uncritical support of Israel has had in attempts to bring peace that benefits both Palestinians and Israelis. And in the context of this attack, how really, I think, as I think it was Shawan Jabareen said on the call, that Foundation for Middle East Peace and Dawn and several other organizations had, if you attack the human rights defenders, and if you close down that space for human rights defenders, if you attack civil society organizations that are providing for the needs of the population, if you close down the possibility of nonviolent protest, then the only paths that are open are those that lead towards more conflict and violence. And so, in this situation, I think it is saying that this is an act that really plays into the hands of those who are least interested in peace, who are least interested in a resolution that benefits people. And so, regardless of what your politics are on this, this needs to be something that is opposed in the interests of really pushing towards a more sustainable and just future.
May it be so. Thank you both so much. And I know we could talk for much longer. For those who've been watching, the video will be sent out for your use. We'll be sure to put the links. Do check out our websites, Foundation for Middle East Peace, American Friends Service Committee, Churches for Middle East Peace. Sign up for our newsletters, our take action, sign those action alerts. Those are just small steps we can take as we continue to be educated. And I know that's not enough, but it's a good start. And so we'll continue to raise the alarm. And as the world might stop paying attention to these issues, we're committed to staying in the game. So thank you both so much. Appreciate it. And good to be with you this morning.
Thank you, May.
Thank you.
Good to be together. Bye-bye.